God, we ask that you teach us something. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Hey, yeah, when do you bracket ready like that?
Like yesterday. Your little prayer slide has like a 5-minute thing, but after about 10 seconds, it's like, nah, I'm gonna check that live stream.
You know how mad my mom gets when this doesn't work?
I bet she tells you about it too.
Yeah, she's not feeling good today.
I mean, if I'd known I was gonna be the tech guy, I could have been like,
Well,
hey,
your mother
missing
probably
some
should not
slides.
have pushed that on you at the last second.
I
But that's
did.
what your mom does.
She sat down there. That's the tech spot.
Leslie knew better than to sit
If
down
you
there.
sit there, you're automatically, that's your job.
Well, now I know for the future.
You notice I always sit on the opposite end.
Hey,
I've got to
next
follow
time,
in.
I'm putting Sojo right there.
I've got to follow in the control room, and Brad makes sure that I press the follow, not the control.
Okay, go to this one. Okay. Then there. Okay. No, I'll say that for it.
Whatever happened to that really easy service that we used to have, Dad? Like, God of
know.
Wonders. I like that God of Wonders.
Can I unmute it now?
Will you go to the next slide?
Is today, today's not the time?
Leave it there for a minute.
Second.
I think it's working. Yeah, you can go to the next one.
Okay, so see, it's that right there. Okay. So don't go to the TV, go to just the fake line.
I think it's pretty good. So I want to go back and cover something that I missed. I think I missed last week in my notes. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows that when I was talking about John, when you go through the book of John, John, when he mentions the name John, is almost always going to be talking about John the Baptist. So I want to make sure I didn't miss that because I think I skipped over a piece of my notes last week. But John, when he's referring to himself, and everybody kind of thinks it's funny but he typically will call himself the beloved disciple. But anytime that you're reading from John to the end of John, if he mentions the name John, he's typically referring to John the Baptist. So I want to make sure that I didn't miss that. If I did, I'm sorry. But anyway, so John the Baptist is questioned by some folks that were sent to the Pharisees asking if he was the Christ. Well, if we look back at that verse, which I'm not going to throw him back up, they ask him if he's the Christ, if he's Elijah, or if he's a prophet or the prophet. And John the Apostle clarifies very quickly that John the Baptist took no such things. He says, no, I'm none of those things. He says, but there is one coming whose sandals I'm not even worthy to tie. So John the Baptist knew his place and his role. We're going to talk a little bit about John the Baptist because Gary had a question last week about, did they know each other? Did they grow up together? And I'm actually going to talk about that before I even get into John chapter 2. Also, just kind of a recap, in chapter 1, Jesus begins calling the disciples. So Jesus calls Andrew and Simon Peter, and at the time, Cephas was the name that he gives him at that very first meeting. Now we'll know that when you go back to some of the other Gospels, that there's another time where James and John are fishing, Andrew and Peter are fishing, and Jesus, if you'll recall, Jesus tells them to go out deep and to cast their nets for a catch. And of course Peter's like, we've been out here all night. We've been doing this all night. And we know that when they do finally obey what Jesus asked them to do, they caught so many fish it almost sunk both of their boats. So this particular deal is most likely before Peter had fully started following Jesus. So you have Andrew and Simon. Jesus renames Peter, renames him Peter in the Greek, Cephas in the Aramaic. So the Apostle John skips the whole fishing story. And you're going to find that's very true about the book of John. What separates it from the synoptic gospels is that most likely, like I told you guys, Matthew wrote his gospel. Mark probably had all of Matthew's gospel written down and then got some eyewitness accounts. And then Luke most likely used Matthew's and Mark's gospel to produce his gospel that he was actually, we call them gospels today, but what Luke was actually doing was sending all of the details that he'd gathered back to Theophilus. So Theophilus had sent Luke. What makes John interesting is that about 90+% of what John writes, you don't find anywhere else. And he's a little bit like Matthew in the respect that he's writing about things that he personally observed. And you got to think of it this way too. It kind of helps in the timing. Matthew obviously comes on board a little later, so it's not like Jesus day one goes out and finds 12 disciples. So he's picking them up as he goes. I mean, obviously with Andrew and Peter, he gets those guys. Probably James and John come on board at the same time. Then it says a little bit later that he runs into Philip, and then Philip tells Nathaniel. So and Nathaniel, by the way, his name is also called Bartholomew. You're going to find James the Lesser, or the chosen, if you've watched it, Little James. But Little James also had another nickname, Thaddeus. And I kind of think of it this way. We're going to get into some of Jesus' brothers' names and some common names, as you'll find. Mary makes walking through the New Testament rough, because even at Jesus' crucifixion, you had Mary, the mother of Jesus, you had Mary Magdalene, you had Mary who was married to Clopas, and so it's hard keeping who's he talking about when. Jesus had a brother named Judas. Of course, we know Judas was one of the disciples that betrayed Jesus. So I'm just saying, as we're walking through, I'm going to try to be very careful to make sure that everybody knows which guy we're talking about. So my bad on the John the Baptizer last week. But throughout John, if I say the name John, I probably will try to tell you that it's the baptizer if he's in there. He does actually come back up in a couple chapters, and very interesting thing that happens with him. So some things that Gary and I talked about last week, and I wanted to cover them, was number one, to have a time, and I think I am going to do it, to where we have the idea of kind of a question-answer service maybe. Where if you guys think about, and I told Gary I'll probably have him submit his in writing, because some of the ones he came up with this last week, they were rough. And we'll go over some of them. But and really what's kind of rough about it is we know that, we know from the Bible that, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The reason that he was born in Bethlehem, not just because the prophets had already said that he would be there, but as you see in the Word, and you're going to see definitely on this first sign today, there are things that God orchestrates and moves so that events happen exactly the way they need to. And Jesus, when he comes on scene and begins his public ministry, which he doesn't until age 30, there's definitely this gap from birth to 30 that we don't have a lot of answers of what was going on. Obviously he had 4 brothers. He had at least 2 sisters. It's kind of interesting, because I was telling Gary the Catholics teach that Mary had no kids. All she had was Jesus. So basically to keep her virginity intact, to keep her importance intact. But the reality of it is that, he had 4 brothers that we know of, and at least a couple sisters. You're going to see them in the story today. The Bible says this. It says that Jesus grew up as a child. The Bible says that Jesus as a child grew and became strong, was filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. But not much is mentioned beyond his birth. We know that Mary and Joseph were both visited by the angel Gabriel, and I'm going to kind of go back and talk about a little bit of the birth story. You find that in Luke. But angel Gabriel, commonly referred to as an angelic messenger, pronounced to Mary as a virgin that was betrothed to Joseph, that she would conceive a son. And what he tells her in that message is that God would give Jesus the throne of his father David, and it would be a forever kingdom. So what Gary and I were talking about is, what exactly did Mary and Joseph know? Did they know that when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that they had just given birth to God? And so those are some of the harder questions over the next 30 years. I mean, did they know he was God? I mean, they certainly knew, according to what Gabriel had told them, that he was going to become a king, and that of his kingdom there would be no end. So we know that Joseph was going to the idea of divorce. So weddings and marriages back in those days were about a year-long process. You would come in, you would be betrothed, a year would pass, and then you would get married. So Joseph had already been betrothed to Mary, but the angel comes to him and says, look, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. He said, and here's the things that you're going to do, and his name's going to be Jesus. So that's the only information that we have until Jesus is born. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And we know that Herod at the time gets a visit from the wise men. And some of these I want to clarify too, because, when we look at the Christmas story, you always know that Jesus is born. You see the three wise men sitting around the manger and some of the shepherds. But here's the truth of that story. The wise men followed a star the day that Jesus was born, and they most likely did not get there on that journey until roughly 2 years had passed. And the reason we kind of have an idea of this timing is because when they stopped off to visit King Herod at the time, they tell him, hey, we've come to worship the king. And so Herod inquires about the star, and he's like, well, when did it show up? So they're like, well, it showed up here. We've been following it ever since. We're going to go. He says, well, when you find this king, he says, you come back and tell me so I may go and worship him. So they didn't show up at the manger. In fact, it says at the time that they're still obviously living in Bethlehem, that they go to a house. That's what the Bible says, that the wise men found Jesus in a house, not in a manger. They didn't stay in a manger for 2 years. They were only there for his birth. But what's interesting is how Christian traditions have snuck in to our idea that, I guarantee you, 99% of the people believe the wise men were sitting there at the manger when Jesus was born, and that wasn't true. The only ones that got to see Jesus there were the shepherds that were out working in the fields when the angels came and told them. 3 wise men? That doesn't say that either. We don't know how many wise men there were. We know that they brought and they gave 3 gifts to Jesus and his family. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But how many wise men? Well, who knows? But we do know that after they had bestowed the gifts, they were visited in a dream, and they were told not to go back to Herod. So they leave, and then, of course, Joseph and Mary are warned by God to flee to Egypt. Now, how long was he in Egypt? Nobody knows. But what's interesting about the timing of it is that when Herod sends out the decree to kill every male child in the region that was age 2 and under, we have an idea, number one, how long it took the wise men to get to Bethlehem. Roughly 2 years. We know roughly how old Jesus obviously had been there before the wise men showed up. And then when they flee, here's the interesting thing, they stay in Egypt until King Herod dies. Same deal. God visits them in a dream, tells them that Herod is no longer and they can come back. Well, Herod literally died after he had made that decree, literally died just a few months after that. So it wasn't as if Jesus stayed in Egypt for years. He was probably only there a few months. Because after him, his son, which you read also in the Bible, Archelaus, takes over the rule. And eventually, Israel becomes a tetrarch. And you see that later when Jesus is 30, that it turns into a province run by 3 kings. So let me catch up on my notes here. Another thing that was interesting, like I said, Gary and I talked about, did John the Baptist and Jesus, did they grow up together? Did they hang out together? I'm going to cover just a little bit of that. Elizabeth, obviously in the scriptures, Elizabeth is a relative of Mary's. And you know that, most likely a cousin. But she conceived a child that in her old age, and it was John the Baptist. So we have Elizabeth and her husband, Zacharias. Zacharias was a Levitical priest. So Zacharias goes into the temple, and it's his turn. If you've never really studied the Levitical, the idea of the Levitical temple and the priests that would come in, they had terms. So it'd be like maybe it was your month, and you would do that until your time was done, Then they would bring in another priest, and he would run the temple. So Zacharias, it was his turn, and he was the priest of the temple. And it says that an angel comes and tells Zacharias that that even though they were advanced, way advanced in years, his wife Elizabeth was going to have a son. And it's almost not that different of a story than Abraham and Sarah, because Zacharias is like, I'm old, my wife is old. And so because he didn't believe the words that the angel had given to him, God mutes Zacharias. So Zacharias doesn't speak at all until after John the Baptist is born. So a question comes up that whether John the Baptist grew up, if they had like a familial relationship, did they go to gatherings together? And I'm going to tell you, most likely, zero. I think the only time that Jesus and John had ever been close to one another was in their mother's wombs. I think the only time that John the Baptist ever sees Jesus, and I'll tell you why, because there's a verse, because Zacharias and Elizabeth were advanced in years, at least the church history was that when they passed away, that John went out to be in the desert, and he became what they call a Nazarite, and he stayed in the desert until, literally the Bible says, until his time was fulfilled, and it was time for him to begin his ministry. So we know that Jesus, after his birth, stayed in Bethlehem 2 years, went to Egypt, comes back from Egypt, and they end up settling in Nazareth, which is Galilee. So if you've never looked at the maps of Israel in Jesus' time, it was divided into states. So if you can think of Galilee not as a town, but more of a state. So it's like Texas. And in the state of Galilee, you have Nazareth, Cana. If you go up around the Sea of Galilee, you start seeing Tiberias. Capernaum's on the coast, but there's several coastal cities in there, and that's where Jesus, if you can think about it, the distance from Nazareth to Cana is roughly 7.5, 8 miles. It takes about an hour and a half to journey, even though it's a little bit mountainous. The distance from Cana to Capernaum, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's what today's story is about, is roughly 15 miles, and it takes roughly 7 to 8 hours. And I know that only because those towns still exist today. They may not be spelled exactly the same, but I can go on Google, I can tap the distance between the two, hit the little, I'm walking this route, and it'll tell me exactly how long it takes. 7 hours, 56 minutes if you want to go from Cana to Capernaum, if you're going to walk. So as I've said about the Christmas narrative, Jesus comes back and they live in Nazareth. And the thing is when you go back to the Old Testament, you'll find tons of prophecies that say he'll be born in Bethlehem. He'll grow up in Nazareth. That's why everybody thinks it's funny, because anytime, even in the chapter 1, when Philip's telling Nathaniel about we found the Christ. And you think about that, guys. We're not at the 22nd chapter. Very first chapter, Philip's literally going and jumping to Nathaniel saying, look, I think we have found the Christ. And of course, Nathaniel's like, where did he come from? He's like, he's from Nazareth. He's like, does anything good come from Nazareth? It echoes through the whole gospel. But he had to come from Nazareth because it had already been decreed. Every single thing that happened, roughly almost 311 distinct things in the Old Testament about the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Christ in the Old Testament, they were fulfilled 100%. And they had to be. So back to John the Baptist. We have very little from the time that Jesus was roughly 2 until he's 12. Remember that at age 12, they had gone up to observe, I don't know exactly what festival. I don't know if it was the feast. I think most likely Passover, but honestly, I don't remember. But Joseph and Mary got there to attend this. Most of the time they would travel in caravans, and Jerusalem is a hike. I mean, it is definitely a hike from Nazareth. So they're down there doing their religious observances, and they accidentally leave 12-year-old Jesus in Jerusalem. They take off on a journey. They realize they've left Jesus behind. So they turn the caravan around. They go all the way back to Jerusalem, and they find 12-year-old Jesus teaching basically in the temple to the rabbis. Now, I won't go deep into that because it's not that important for today, but from age 12 until age 30, crickets. There's nothing. Same thing with John the Baptist. From the time John the Baptist was born, we know that he became a Nazarite, but outside of that, nothing. So I'm going to get to the verses here in just a minute to just come up. I told you guys that Mary had 4 other sons. And it's very important. And the reason I tell you these things are important is because religion does a very bad job of trying to fit Jesus into a narrative. Of taking Mary and fitting her into a narrative. Or saying that Jesus didn't turn water into wine, he turned it into non-alcoholic grape juice. That's a manipulation of the Bible to fit what they want it to fit. But in the Bible it says that Mary had 4 other sons. Their names were James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. They had at least 2 unnamed daughters. We never get their names. But you can find those in Matthew 13, 55 and 56. We know that there's nothing historical or biblical to support the notion that somehow Joseph had brought kids with them. Never says that. There's nothing biblical to support the notion that Mary didn't have a relationship with Joseph and have other kids. He had at least 6. There's certainly nothing mentioned to Joseph or Mary. You have to think about the interactions that God had via the angels to Mary and Joseph. There were few and far between. There was just a few interactions. But there was nothing that the angel said to them that forbade Mary from having other kids. So, most likely John the Baptist never saw Jesus as he was growing up. The Bible says that John the Baptist stayed in the desert until the day his ministry started. And John the Baptist says this in verse 31. He says, I myself did not know him, but for this purpose I came baptizing with water that he might be revealed to Israel. So John the Baptist is saying, I didn't know him. But God literally took John the Baptist out of the desert when it was the right time for him to begin preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And then we know that eventually Jesus and John the Baptist do collide when Jesus comes to John the Baptist to be baptized. Now, had they run across each other as their ministries were beginning? Yeah, maybe. But obviously, from the time that those guys were born till the time they were 30, according to John the Baptist, they had never been together. Their ministries were on 2 different paths. And we know that Jesus' path truly didn't start until age 30. And the reason that's so important is because when we look into the ideas of what would it have been like for 4 brothers and 2 sisters to be raised around a godchild that never screwed up, never sinned, never made mistakes. I mean, even to the questions of what would it have been like to be Mary and Joseph and know that you've got, my suspicion is I know they didn't. They truly didn't have a complete understanding of who and what Jesus was going to be. Did they know that Jesus was God in the flesh in their hands? I don't think so. I think they knew that he was endowed by God to do things, but how much of that was revealed, I don't know. The other thing that's just kind of speculation, because there's nothing in the Bible that says it, but it's also very interesting, is Jesus is growing up. He's already had a plot to take his life out by the king of Israel. And some of my suspicion is, I'd be interested, I'll only know when I get to heaven, but Gary and I were talking about that if Mary and Joseph weren't very protective of Jesus. I mean, they already had to flee. You know, when they were coming back from Egypt, it says that Archelaus had taken the throne and they were scared of him, so they moved off to another. You know, they end up going exactly where God wanted them to go. But I could see Mary and Joseph wanting to be very protective of who they were raising. Now, it's very interesting because, you know, if you watch The Chosen, you know, Peter's running around all the time. They're all running around trying to protect Jesus. Every episode, they're like, man, we got to do a better job. We got to do something's going to happen to him. And things are getting fired up, and he's making waves, and the Pharisees are mad, the Sadducees are mad. We got to protect him. And one of my favorite scenes is, you know, James and John, they get basically kind of rebuking for being the sons of thunder. But they look at each other and they're like, I don't really know that he needs our protection. The reason I say that is because Joseph and Mary didn't really know who this child was. I mean, they were watching him grow, but did they truly grasp the concept that they had God in the flesh? I don't think so. Did those disciples, as they were walking forward? No, not till much later. Not John, even John, who writes this gospel, who gives us that beautiful introduction at the beginning, that he was in the beginning, that he was God, that he is God. John doesn't come to that realization. The Apostle John doesn't come to that until after he's resurrected. None of these guys truly understood what Jesus was doing. What they thought was the same thing that Mary and Joseph would have been taught, was that, hey, a son to you is born. Unto you a son is given. Unto you a child is born. And this government is going to rest upon his shoulders. All of these guys at the beginning of these Gospels believe that Jesus is coming to rule. Coming to take and break the yoke of the Roman Empire off their back. Because they had been passed around from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians to the Greeks, and now they're the Romans. They have been beat on for 5. And here this child's born, and I guarantee you, brothers, sisters, mom, dad, disciples all believed that what was coming right now was a king. A king not to free them of their sins. They weren't even looking at that. They thought they got a king to free them from bondage. That's what they were looking for. That's what they wanted. You're going to find that John the Baptist, even though he tells them, look, here comes, behold, the Lamb who comes to take away the sins of the world. But as we progress through the Gospel of John, we'll find that even John the Baptizer wasn't 100% sure who Jesus was. So just remember that as we get into this second verse, that no one at this point of the Gospel had truly grasped who Jesus is. None of them have an idea of what he's truly there for. They don't understand his mission. They don't understand his plans. Some of the things he says are so out there that they don't even question it sometimes. We're going to see that today, that they don't even question it because they truly cannot wrap their minds around it. So some questions to just kind of ponder as we go through. Jesus never would have been disobedient to his mother and his father. Why? Because he was sinless. The 5th commandment in the Old Testament, found in Exodus chapter 20, says to obey and bring honor to your mother and your father. Honor your mother and father. It's the only commandment in the Bible that comes with a promise, both to the person that honors their mother and father and to the land that they live in. Because it says that if you honor your mother and father, number one, you live long in the land that God has given you. God didn't give you and I the land of Israel. God gave us the land that we're in now, the United States of America. But if you honor your mother and father, it means that God will bless you with a long life in the land that you're living in. And the reason I bring that up in this deal is because there's a verse that is pretty complicated, that Mary will ask Jesus a question, and it seems as though he's being rude. But I'm going to tell you up front, Jesus never violated any of the 10 commandments. He didn't violate any of the 611 Levitical laws. Jesus kept every one of them. He had to. He had to be sin-free. So that's the number one thing. So here's some questions for you. All of Jesus' siblings, did any of them realize that Jesus was God? And just hang on to that as we run through the book of John. I say most likely they did not until after Jesus was resurrected. We know that James follows him. Another misconception that a lot of people have is that they didn't even believe in him. that his brothers didn't believe in him. But I'm telling you, there's nothing in the Bible that says that either. Talk about that here in a little more detail here in a minute. Mary is told by Simeon, if y'all remember that, I think that is in the book of Matthew. I'm not 100% sure. But when Jesus was still a child, Simeon prophesied over Jesus. And literally, I mean, Simeon was very old. He was about to die. But he'd been told that he would see the Christ before he died. So here he is, old. They bring in Jesus, and immediately he starts to tell them, here is what Jesus is fixing to be. Simeon declared that Jesus was to bring salvation, a light to the Gentiles, and be the glory of the people of Israel. Simeon states that Jesus was destined for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, which was a prophecy of the acceptance and the rejection of Jesus as a Christ in his ministry. And then he told Mary that a sword would pierce through her soul also, without totally verbalizing what was going to happen to Jesus. He was, in effect, he was prophesying that Jesus would break Mary's heart, which happened at the cross. I think that some of these facts would have been hidden from his siblings for the mere thing that, and I'm the worst, guys. This week I've been given a secret, and Gary doesn't like secrets, and I'm starting to not like them either. Because every time somebody gives me a secret, I tell it. Not on purpose, but it's coming out. It's like I can't hang on to a secret for more than a few minutes. So I do believe that Mary and Joseph probably didn't reveal everything to these siblings because they're probably no different than me. You'll see that as we're running through the gospel too, Jesus tries to keep some of these things on the down low. Why? Because he had X amount of time to get to point B. And point B, you'll find, is the cross. His whole journey, his whole mission, everything that he was trying to do was to get there. That's why when he starts off and heals a few people, or does gives a sign, he wants those folks to keep that on the DL. He wants it on the down low because he's trying to get from here to here. It's not that Jesus just wants to be crucified. Not that he just wants to take away the sins of the world. He does it methodically. He wants to be crucified on the Passover. Why? Because it's Passover lamb. Doesn't want to be brought in the middle of September. He literally fulfilled the very first festival that was given. Remember in the when Moses comes to get them out, that's the very first thing he does. It's the very first thing that they remember. It was the very first holiday that they observed. Jesus comes in on the very first of those. I'll tell you why that's interesting, because as you walk through the Bible, you're going to find that every single holiday, in the order that they occur, fits a significant event in Jesus' life. Passover being number one, it was the number one. Number two, you start getting into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why is that important? Because the leaven was the sin. So while Jesus sit in the earth, takes away the sin of the world, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then, of course, we get to resurrection. The festival that ties into is called the Festival of First Fruits, because Jesus was the first fruit from the grave. We can keep going through all of them, but they're an interesting study. But where they're at now is the fifth of those festivals. And that festival is called the Feast of Trumpets. What's interesting about the rapture, guys? What does it say about that? The sound of the... Is it any trumpets? It's the last trumpet. And we know that there's trumpet judgments, but what's interesting about the idea of the Feast of Trumpets, the fact that these things all end on a significant festival, is that they've had the Feast of Trumpets, ever since the Old Testament, ever since Moses, ever since God decreed that they would observe these Feast of Trumpets. There will be a day where it'll be the last Feast of Trumpets. And that will be the day that we leave this place. It's unknown. When Joseph passed away, so as we run through the Bible, you'll see this. Joseph's not mentioned from the time that Jesus starts his ministry at age 30. So, even though it doesn't say, church history has a little bit of speculation in it, we know that Joseph's not in the picture. We know this because when Jesus is on the cross, what is interesting, and I won't totally flesh that out because I'll cover it when I get there, but Jesus hands the baton of the obligation as a firstborn son over his mother Mary to the Apostle John. Even though he has 4 brothers, could have taken Mary, but it becomes very important, these little nuances of where they lived, where they were, how long did it take to walk. And it's interesting, as you're reading this, yes, do I want you to get and understand the words? 100%. Yes, I do. But I'm telling you, it becomes richer if you dig deep into understanding who is Jesus? What did it look like? What did these places look like? How long did it take to walk there? Where did they go? I mean, if it wasn't important, they wouldn't do stuff like, well, on the 3rd day he shows up here, and the next day they were here, and the next day they were. It's important where he's going, where they're traveling, who's there. You know, the only danger I see in The Chosen is that they do a little bit of backstory that obviously is not in this, but they've done a very good job of showing the relationships that Jesus would have had, the things that were important, the relationship he had with his mother, the relationships that he had with these disciples. It's unknown what Joseph passed away or when he passed away, but he's obviously gone by the time Jesus starts his ministry. We know he was there at age 12 because Mary and Joseph came back, but somewhere between age 12 and age 30, Joseph was gone. So in this clip that I'm fixing to show you guys, here's something also interesting, and something we also don't know for 100%. It's speculated that Mary's sister was Salome. If you've watched The Chosen, you get pretty familiar with Salome. But Salome was married to Zebedee, and Salome and Zebedee's offspring were James and John, the sons of thunder. It's just another name as we look through here. Maybe the relationship that Jesus probably would have had with James and John, they most likely were cousins. You know, they would have probably grown up together, which is interesting. So I want you guys to watch this clip. Jordan, if you just go to the next slide. And you might turn this up, Les. I'm not sure.
Join us in the song of music.
There's a lot of wine.
But it's only the first day.
Yes, and it's all gone. Not a drop left.
Why are you telling me this?
We can't let the celebration end like this. And the Etcher's family humiliated.
Boys, go join the others. I'll be right there. Mother, my time has not yet come.
If not now, when? Du better hit it.
Fill these jars with water. I'm not sure you heard her clearly, but we've run out of wine, not water. These are similar in size to your own forehead.
The prudent monks, yes. You could have filled all the way to the brim.
You're a very responsible person, aren't you?
We are in a crisis, and I was led to understand you have a solution.
Do you know why jars for purification rites are made of stone?
What?
You heard me.
Because the stone is pure. Less likely to stain or break, and it can't be made unclean.
Yes. Fill these jars with water all the way to the brim.
Why?
You heard him. Start drawing water, quickly. Tell anyone you find to stop what they're doing and help.
From the directions you have provided, I see no logical solution to the problem.
It's going to be like that sometimes, Thomas.
What did you say?
I do not rebuke you. It is good to ask questions, to seek understanding.
There's no time for this.
I know of a man like you in Capernaum, always counting, always measuring.
That's my job. And the people will think I have not done well tonight.
Join me, and I will show you a new way to count, to measure, a different way of seeing time.
Go with you where? I don't understand.
Keep watching.
No.
Abner, I do hope you're enjoying yourself.
Where are the servants?
I don't know, but I'll go find them right away.
It is far past time for another round of wine. The last one was nearly an hour ago.
Yes, well, you see...
Surely there is more coming, Diana.
I'm very sorry. Please do not worry. This will be taken care of in...
Next round of wine right away. Thank you for reminding us it's all in the contract.
Was your father a stonemason as well?
Smith. I think it broke his heart. I apprenticed under a stonecutter when I was 9. Every man must leave his father.
Masonry seems like hard work.
It isn't harder, it's just more fun. If the smith wants to change the horseshoe or the plowshare or the pothook, he has only to put the iron back into the fire and reshape it to fit his designs.
Therefore,
Everyone, please step outside. Just for a moment, Thomas.
Once you make that first cut into the stone, it can't be undone. It sets in motion a series of choices. What used to be a shapeless block of limestone or granite begins its long journey of transformation. And it will never be the same.
Where is your father? Go draw some out and serve it to the master of the banquet.
Well, it's about time.
The water vintage, sir.
Stop the music! Stop the music! Everyone, listen! I have something I would like to say. I would like to address the bridegroom and the bride families. At every wedding I've ever overseen, they serve the best wine first. And then, when the people have drunk freely, much later in the feast, they serve the poorer wine, the cheap stuff. Because by then, who is going to notice? Am I right? But you've chosen now to serve the best wine I have ever tasted. Let us thank them for this unnecessary but honorable gesture. May the wedding of Asher, son of Rafi and Dinah, to Sarah, daughter of Abner and Hila, be as pure and as fruitful as this wine. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth the fruit of the vine. To Asher and Sarah!
Is something wrong?
Yes. Algos.
There you go, Dixon. Now, the reason I wanted to show that whole thing is, for one, there's I almost jumped you every time I watch it, is that there is a verse that's coming up, and I wanted you to see the interaction between Jesus and his mom. I'm going to start there, but so in verse 1, it's enlisted. Come on, guys. It's okay, Drew. No, not you. I'm not saying this was you.
Blame you. I was like, I'm innocent, I swear.
Just want to make sure I don't miss this little piece. So verse 1, it says this: on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And as I told you guys, Cana is roughly about 7.5, 8 miles north of Nazareth. And it says, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. So here's what we don't know. Or here's what we can kind of speculate. Is that Mary, portrayed here, was helping Dinah. We don't know who the people are that are getting married. It's never fleshed out. But most likely, here's what we will find out as we get to the end of it. All of Jesus' brothers are there. Mary's there. The reason we know that is because when they leave Cana at the end of this chapter, it says that Jesus left with his disciples, his brothers, and his mother. So they're all here. So most likely, this wedding that they're depicting here is Mary, Jesus, his brothers, his family, they're probably related to whomever this is at a wedding. Now, if you've never traveled to any other parts of the world, especially that part of the world, weddings were not a day-long event like they are here. They were a week-long event. I mean, they would literally start on a day, and you'd probably run for a week, maybe two. That's how long the celebrations lasted. Even in India, what's interesting when I'd see them is they would start, they would get married, and then they would basically have a band that would walk through the town, and it was a free-for-all. Any and all could show up because they were going to have a marriage festival at a place. What's interesting about this is whatever Mary's role is, it appears that she is responsible or has some responsibility for the supplies of this wedding. So Mary's there, her sons are there, Jesus and his disciples are there, and I can tell you that just knowing how the rest of John plays out, he does not have all of his disciples. Now, I will tell you this, Thomas, is in this one, is not mentioned in this verse. They just threw Thomas in there. But he's talking about there's another guy in Capernaum that also likes to count. And that person that he's talking about is Matthew. Now that does probably make sense that Matthew wasn't on board at this time because Matthew does not mention that in his gospel. So we know just from the writer that James and John were there, Andrew and Peter probably there. Here they're showing Philip. But we don't really know who all's there. But we can pretty much guess that Matthew's not. Was Thomas there? Who knows? But I just want to make sure that I love that clip because it's beautiful. But not everything in that clip is 100%. So let me get through some others. So here's what we do know. From the prior verse, we know that James and John are in the story. We know that Andrew and Peter are in the story. We know that Philip and Nathaniel are in the story. So at the very least, we've got 6 disciples walking with Jesus. We already know from Matthew that Jesus has 4 brothers. Most likely, even though it doesn't mention it here, probably his sisters there too. If this was a family event, so probably his sisters and then his mom. So at the very least, we've got 12 people just in his disciples, brothers, mom, sisters, whoever else is following Jesus at this place. And I'll tell you why that's important here in just a minute. So we can assume at this point that 6 people are probably following Jesus, that he and his disciples were invited to the wedding. His mom was already there, which means she probably was helping set up the wedding. I've already told you guys that Galilee is a province, much like a state, and that Cana is a town in Galilee. Israel was divided into several ideas of a state in Jesus' time. You had Judea, which was the further south kingdom. In between it, you had a state that was called Samaria. To the east of Galilee, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, you have what was called the Decapolis. 2-hour walk from Nazareth to Cana, 8 hours from Cana to Capernaum. Based on the urgency of what Mary's fixing to say, we know that she had some relation to the groom. So verse 3. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Back to the idea of a 1-week wedding festival or 2 weeks. It's what's kind of interesting. When Mary comes to Jesus to say he's run out of wine, well, his 2 disciples are sitting there. Now, this doesn't happen in this story, but it is interesting in the chosen that they're like, this is day 1. They knew that was a big deal. And I want you guys to understand, running out of wine was a big deal. And Mary had come to Jesus because there was no fixing a big deal in the middle of the night on a wedding feast. And the way weddings would work is depending on what country you're from, but specifically Israel, typically the father and mother of the bridegroom, it was their job to make sure that everything was there. It would be very embarrassing if they ran out of wine, if they ran out of food, if they weren't prepared. So Mary coming to Jesus with a problem that they could not fix to save maybe even her own face if she was responsible for the festivities, and it's possible that she was. But they had run out, and they had no way to fix it. It's interesting that, number one, that Gary and I were talking about, that regardless of what Mary knew, what the siblings knew of Jesus, whatever she knew he could fix it. I don't know whether he'd done any other miracles. I don't know whether there were any other signs that as he was growing up. But at this point in time, at this place, at this event, Mary knew that Jesus could fix it. I mean, there's no going out and making wine in the middle of the night. And there's probably no running to town to buy any more wine. But she knew that Jesus could fix it. So she brings the problem to Jesus and tells him that they have no wine. In verse 4, the other reason I wanted to watch that clip, and Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." We'll hang there for just a moment. When he says woman, it's not rude. What he's doing, and you'll see him do it again later, when Mary shows up with her brothers and they're requiring and asking for Jesus, and Jesus looks out to his disciples and his crowd and he goes, "Who's my mother? Who is my brother?" It says it's those that are about the kingdom's business, that are doing the things that God the Father has asked them to do. And it wasn't like he was saying, I don't need them. I mean, they don't mean nothing to me. But what he's doing here, and that's very important, is Jesus, number one, is letting his mother know, my private responsibilities, my private life with you is different than my public life with my Father God. I'm starting something here that, I love you, Mom, but these things, where I'm heading and what I'm doing now is down a different path. And I can tell you another reason that he wasn't rude, he wouldn't have been disobedient, because he's sinless, so he can't violate the 5th commandment to honor your mother and father. But the real reason that I know that he wasn't is ultimately in her response. So we get that, not yet. Oh. He's telling his mother the difference between his private obligations to her as his son, as her son, public obligation as the Son of God. The statement implies that he wanted to set straight the parameters of the relationship now that his ministry was beginning. The other thing that it says, not only to his mom, but it also says the same thing to his brothers and sisters, is that his family relationships were no longer going to be the determining factor in Jesus' life from here on out. Jesus constantly reminded everybody that he was headed to Calvary. And he didn't want anybody to get that mixed up. When Peter would try to move him off to some place, Jesus' response to him was, "Get behind me, Satan. I've got a place that I'm going to, and none of you guys can interfere with the plan that God has given me." Here he's not being rude to Mom, but he's letting her know that I've got a path to walk, and I cannot let anybody sidetrack me from here on out. Jesus was sent by God to accomplish a very specific task, to bear the sins of the world and to build a kingdom. That was the task that Jesus came down from heaven. You have to remember that Jesus came to earth of his own free will, but he was sent by his Father. It says that his Father sent Jesus to take away the sins of the world. So the request by Mary was not part of the... We'll find out here in a little bit. It kind of was. May not have been part of the Master's plan for that moment, for what Jesus was fixing to start off and work and what he was doing. But as we're going to find out, it's going to do something specific to those disciples. We know that Jesus would eventually rile up the religious. I mean, he was constantly messing with the Pharisees, constantly messing with the Sadducees, who were constantly coming to trip him up. Jesus don't get very far in his ministry before they start plotting ways to get rid of him. But Jesus did have to be somewhat careful to get to the timing of where he wanted, and this was part of what he was trying to tell his mom, that the request was pushing up his clock of the grand reveal according to Jesus, because why? His hour had not yet come. Now his mom didn't know that, the disciples didn't know that. But as you read through the Gospels, you're going to find that when Jesus starts his ministry, laser focused. And he's laser focused on Golgotha, which meant the skull. That's where he was headed. That's where he wanted to go. Okay, next verse. In verse 5, his mother's not upset. She's not got her feelings hurt. Nothing. There's no other words that's even spoken. She simply turns around, just like she did in that clip, and says, do whatever he tells you. And the reason I want that, because I don't want anybody to think when Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? That's why I like the way they played that off in that clip, because Jesus was very sweet. And his mom knew, without him saying a word, he was going to fix it. Now, I don't know if she knew exactly how he was going to fix it. My suspicion is no. But he says, do whatever he says. So Mary was not offended by Jesus' words. In fact, her turning around and speaking to those servants answered the fundamental question that Mary, number one, knew that he could fix the problem, knew he had the ability to fix the situation. No other words exchanged between Mary and Jesus. And I suspect maybe not 100%, but I think Mary also understood what Jesus was saying. Probably truly understood the boundaries that were now fixing to have to come in place for Jesus to fulfill his ministry. I know that's hard. It's not easy for moms. Moms love their kids. And in fact, I've learned with my parents, apparently you're never not a kid. I'm just like a 50-year-old kid to my parents. But they always feel like they've got this responsibility and they've got these things that never really change. I mean, my daughter's always my daughter. My son's always my son. And no matter how old they get, I still, a little piece of my heart still looks at them like they're 12, 13 years old. So it never stops. Mary's the same deal, and Jesus is having to tell her in this moment, look, Mom, these things that you've treasured in your heart, all these things, I'm fixing to change and move down this path. In the last 30 years, they were the last 30 years. But these next 3.5 years are fixing to be very different. In verse 6 through 10, it says, now there were 6 stone water jars that were there for the Jewish rites of purification. He is right. They've kind of fleshed that out. They were called earthenware if they were made out of pottery and they were porous. You'll find out as Jesus continues through the idea of wine, he keeps talking about new wine being put into new wine bags. Because if you put new wine into old wine bags, they'll burst, they'll be ruined. Even though it's not the true transliteration here, the idea of wine that Jesus was bringing, the new wine that went into the new bags, was that Jesus was changing the ideas of the Old Testament religion, and he was bringing a new idea. Remember, Jesus said, you can take up on me my yoke, because my yoke is easy and my burdens are light. And wine was the idea that Jesus constantly gave to everybody to let them know this wine that I'm bringing, this wine that I'm making is new. That's new to you. The reason this miracle is so important is because it is the beginning of the system that Jesus was bringing. It was the beginning of the kingdom. It was the beginning of everything. And it was the start that would catapult it. You'll see why that's also important. The Levitical rules made the jars pure and not subject to ritual contamination or impurity. I mean, that fleshed out pretty good on that. It said there were 6 stone jars that were there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So this ain't just a little bit of wine that he's creating. I mean, we got 6 of them. So you're talking about 120 to 150 gallons of wine. The other reason that was important is because if they ran out of wine that quick, day one of a wedding, they probably didn't have enough money. Or more people showed up than were invited. That also happens. Because when I would see them run through the streets of Jerusalem, those wedding parties would get huge. There'd be hundreds of people in them. And everybody was invited, and they were expected to feed and provide alcohol for all of them. I don't know exactly what the Jewish traditions were, or that it confirms what he said, that the good wine comes first, and once everybody's drunk freely, they bring the cheap stuff out. That's just common sense, guys. We would do the same thing. Get the good stuff up front, pour stuff later. Nobody's even gonna know, all right? I don't know what the Jewish traditions are, but that's just common sense. So that's what makes this story so sweet. In verse 7, it said, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So here's the other thing that's interesting. I mean, sometimes we have the idea of them here, but they were basically the MC. The master of the banquet's job was to make sure the ceremonies traveled at the right time, the food came out at the right time, the wedding was, or that wine was being transported around the group at a certain time. He was just his job to make sure everything's running the way it was supposed to. And everyone always hired a master of the banquet. And, you know, when we're talking about reputations on the line here, running out of wine's a big deal. It also hurts the master of the banquet. Usually the master of the banquet's job is to make sure, hey, everything is running smoothly the way it's supposed to. And they were hired, and they made their money on how good they were at it. So the master of the banquet, it says, so now draw some out, take it to the master of the feast, or the master of the banquet. So they took it. Another thing before we go too much further. Who's getting to see what happens here? And who else? Not everybody. Who's getting to see this first sign?
Mary. Children.
The servants, guys. It's another thing that's very interesting about watching Jesus run through. The Pharisees, the rich, the religious, they constantly come to Jesus asking for signs. Where's my sign? Where's the sign? Where's the sign of this? Why? What gives you the authority to do these things? And what's so interesting about what Jesus does and what Jesus brings is that the people that get to see the very first sign are the servants. His disciples who were also came from lowly background. Remember Mary, when she says her long spiel when she's with Elizabeth, she says, the Lord magnifies my soul. And she goes on to talk about that God had reached out of heaven and it had reached to somebody who was lowly, in lowly state. She was poor. She ate nothing. Same reason that he brought shepherds to see Jesus in the manger. The same reason that servants that are out here helping with the wedding feast get to see the very first sign. It's a common theme with Jesus that he didn't come to impress the elite. He didn't come to impress the rich. And he's revealing things to the lowest of servants. The people running around, sweeping up the floors, pouring the wine. That's the people that get to see what Jesus does. When the master of the feast tasted the water that had now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, because Jesus let them in on that little secret. So the servants knew what had happened. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. The beautiful story. Jesus did exactly what his mother asked. We'll run out of wine. And then Jesus takes and invites the servants and the hired help and allows them to see him turn 6 stone pots into wine. Master of the banquet didn't know. As far as we know, the bridegroom didn't know. The bride didn't know. I don't know who all knew what. But I know that when the master of the banquet got the water that had been turned into wine, the servants knew. Mary knew. And we know that the disciples knew. Because in verse 11 it says this. This is the first of his signs. Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Now I'm going to hang there for just a moment. Why was it important? Did it fit the plan? And nothing really gets God off his plans. Nothing. But what it did do is it manifested his glory to his disciples. Jesus is fixing to ask a great deal of these disciples. They're just getting little bits and pieces, and that's the other thing about Jesus. Jesus doesn't just come in, punch of day one. He's slowly trying to reveal who he is, what he's here for. This first sign does one thing. It manifests his glory, and they believed in him. It does the same things for us. When we look at his goodness, when we look at the way that he deals with us, it does one thing. It manifests his glory. And we believe in him. We have faith in him. Why? Because just like this, he didn't want his mother to be shamed because they ran out of wine. He fixed it. He's always going to be a problem fixer. For us, every day, he's fixing a problem for us. That's why his grace and mercy is new every morning. It was a sign to show the group that Jesus, number one, was no ordinary rabbi, but he was God in the flesh, that he was endowed with power from his Father, and the result of his sign was the disciples believed in him. Where Jesus' ministry was heading would require his disciples to buy into God's mission and his plans. Eventually, his disciples would have to carry the gospel of the kingdom to the four corners of the world in the absence of Jesus, because he would go back to his Father. Jesus needed them to believe in him. The sign was not evident to all. Most of the wedding party probably would have no idea what had just happened. They would never have a clue. But the servants, the disciples, his brothers, his sisters, his mom, they knew. The lowly, the ones at the bottom of the social pecking order, just like the shepherds, they would have been ushered into the presence of God. They are the ones who God invites. The group present, most likely all of Jesus' family, Jesus' brothers, I believe that they all believed in him. The idea that somehow Jesus' brothers and family didn't believe in him, I don't believe that at all. I believe, just like the disciples here, I think they all believed in him. From that day forward, and just remember that as we walk through the gospel. I mean, Jesus doesn't pick his brothers and sisters or anybody necessarily to walk in that deal. He has separated himself here, is what he was telling Mary. But we know James from the book of James was Jesus' brother. And he does play a role in Jesus' ministry. It says in verse 12, after this he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So I don't know that Mary and his brothers, or if they stayed with him, off and on throughout his ministry, but we do know that they traveled together. And this is Jesus doing his ministry, and his family's running with him. I'm not going to really cover the rest of it because I kind of wanted to keep this short. And I don't know that I'm going to cover every single chapter or every single verse in every chapter. There are just a few quick things that I want to mention. In verses 13 through 22, Jesus walks into the temple, and it says that he basically braids up a whip of cords and runs around and runs the money changers out of the temple. The religious come to him, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they come to him, and they're asking Jesus for a sign. It's so interesting because Jesus had just given his very first sign, and he gave it to the lowly, gave it to the servants, gave it to his disciples. The Jews come requesting a sign from him, basically seeking what authority he has to be doing what he's doing in their temple. He gives them nothing, except for he tells them that if they destroy that temple in 3 days, he'll raise that up. What's interesting about the back end of that verse, of course, this is John the Apostle that's writing these words, is that he's basically given his disciples a prediction of his death and his resurrection. He said, if you tear this thing down, in 3 days, I'm going to build it back up. It'll be restored. John writes in that verse that even he nor any of the other disciples even understood what Jesus was saying. They didn't understand it until after Jesus was resurrected. I'm going to read just a little piece at 23 through 25. It says, now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. So where is he at? He's in Jerusalem. He's there at the Passover. And we know that he's going to be back in Jerusalem on a Passover roughly 3 years from right now. Because he's going there to die. But right now he's sitting there in Jerusalem at Passover. It says that many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. Now we don't know what other signs he was doing at the time. But he was doing signs in Jerusalem on the Passover. And in 24 it says, but Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. Another thing I want you guys to hang on to is we're walking through this Bible. Jesus can look into the hearts of men. Jesus can hear the thoughts that are in their minds. When he approaches a person, he don't have to figure them out. We don't have that luxury. We've got to get to know somebody. But when Jesus comes to somebody, he knows them. And that's important because every disciple that he picks, including Judas, that betrays him, was chosen for a purpose. Jesus knew what was in the heart of Judas the day that he met him, and he chose him for that very reason. In fact, the Bible later says he was doomed, before he was even born, he was doomed to destruction. God had a plan for him before he was even born. It was to be the betrayer of Jesus. But as we walk through this Bible, just know that he knows all people. He is omniscient. He's omnipotent. Means he's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. The only things that he doesn't have are the things that God the Father has excluded for him. Like he didn't know the hour of the day that he would come back to put his foot on the Mount of Olives. So vice versa, neither do we. We have no idea. But he said only his Father knew that. Not the angels. So there are some things that Jesus is in this earthly body that God the Father has held back from God the Son. God the Son is always obedient to God the Father. But the one thing that's not is he knows all people. And needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Anybody got any questions today? Jordan, you 100%? Nana?
If he told Mary that it was not his time or his hour to do this deed with the wine, God told him to do that? He did not, this was not in his plan?
When he's saying that my hour has not come yet, it's not my hour.
But he went ahead and did it.
Yeah, what he's trying to tell Mary is I'm number one, he's trying to divide himself away from mom and son. And he's saying, look, Mom, you're wanting me to do these things, but these things are part of this, and my hour has not come yet. It's just saying the timing wasn't right. So, I mean, it'd be like if you asked me to do this thing, and I'm like, look, now's not really a good time, Mom. But we know that his response to that was to turn around and tell them servants, you do whatever he asks. So, Jesus is telling her, now's not the time. You're not 100% understanding what my ministry is about, or me going public, or when I'm supposed to go public, or when I'm supposed to go to this place. But regardless, she turned around and said, so she knew he was going to do it. The look on his face, yeah, he was going to do it. He loved his mom.
Was that doubting Thomas in there with him?
Well, yeah, he's not in this. He's not in the gospel here. But yeah, they bring Thomas in here, and Thomas doesn't end up. I don't know if you watch The Chosen. It's like 2 or 3 days later, they pop up and meet Jesus. So So yeah, but he doesn't have all the disciples at this part. You know, he's going to get 12. He's got roughly 6 probably right now. And it does fit the narrative of him going to Capernaum, picking up Matthew. You know, Matthew's a tax collector, but it also fits that this story is not in Matthew's gospel. It's not Matthew's, it's not Mark's, it's not Luke's. And that makes sense that Matthew hadn't already been picked up. And he's not mentioned. So, but yeah, this is the first sign. Pretty cool.
So this was God's purpose for Jesus to be able to tell his mother, there's a difference here. We have to separate.
Yeah, it's more of a, that's why I'm saying, so the Hebrew word, you know, the Hebrew word for father is Abba. What's interesting is it's also the Greek word for father is Abba. But Abba is almost more of a dad word. It's like dad. Instead of Jordan saying father, which she does do that to me sometimes. But Abba's kind of the idea of dad. So the name for mom is Ema. So Jesus doesn't say Ema to her. So he's being specific. Woman's a really weird translation for the Greek into that. It really kind of means more like something like ma'am. You know, it's basically it's still a sign of respect, like madam. But he looks at her and he doesn't call her Ema, which would be this loving, hey, me and you are, you know, son and mother. But he's saying basically, ma'am, out of respect, ma'am, this is not my time.
An expression of polite distance.
Yeah. So he's separating himself from mom a little bit. He's not saying Ema, but he's saying, ma'am. Yeah, it's an interesting separation. I mean, did it change God's plan? No. God was going to do these. God, like I say, when I say God's all-knowing, he knows everything. Even Jesus, at this part of his ministry, he knows everything. Did he know that he was going to turn water into wine at that wedding when he got there? Yeah, he did. There's nothing he did not know. Did he know his mom was going to make that request? Yes, he did. There's nothing he does not know.
It's interesting that you said at the start of this to keep in mind that did his family really know who he was? And I think there's some truth in that they don't fully understand because this has never happened before. So they don't really have like we grew up knowing this stuff, you know, so we know that God became man, you know, but they didn't know that. So it's like what you said before that there wasn't no New Testament when the New Testament was happening. So it's interesting that you say that did they really know? So I don't think they fully understood what it was or what Jesus' purposes was and how that was going to play out. They couldn't have known. But she goes to him and says, hey, we have this issue. I know nobody can make wine in the next 15 minutes, but you probably can. Go ahead. You know what I mean? And then she just trusts that he does it. Do whatever he tells you to do. Fix it. She knows he's going to fix it. She may not know that he is what he is, but she knows he can fix the problem.
Well, that's the brain deal that Gary started early this week.
Well, yeah, because when you think about, I mean, so when the angel came to her and they were going to call him Emmanuel, meaning God with us. So you would always have that in the back of your mind, right? I'm going to have a baby, he's going to call this, and that means God with us.
Yeah, but the thing is, when they call him Emmanuel, I don't know if in their mind, like I said, I don't know what first century rabbis believed of that particular verse. That God was going to be with them, meaning that this king that was going to come in was going to have this kingdom, that the government would be upon his shoulders, and he'd be called this. I mean, honestly, one of the titles is Everlasting Father. So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's just like you say, though, that he, you know, they all thought he was coming to free them from their oppressors, but he didn't. He came as the lamb. He didn't come as the lion. So it's interesting that because they have this long-standing belief that he's coming to free them. They tired their oppressors.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That first 30 years, I don't know what he did. I don't know if the brothers were around and, you know, like maybe a brother breaks his leg and Jesus comes over there and fixes his leg real quick. I don't know. I have no idea what Jesus was doing in those 30 years. But yeah, I agree that somehow Mom does have an understanding of what he's kind of capable of. Now, whether he did those things in those 30 years, I don't know. Maybe this was like old hat. Maybe they run out of wine one time at the house, and Jesus like, "No, I got this." I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, it is interesting because as a parent, you always see your children, you kind of have an understanding of what your children's potential is. But you don't really fully know what it is they will accomplish. You know, you know what they can do, but don't really know what they will do.
Well, here's my hope. I want you guys to keep, as we walk through it, is to keep the ideas and the wonder of it. Because I can't answer all those questions, but they're very interesting ideas of what Jesus would have been like then, what he brought to the table, what mom knew. You know, the other thing is I definitely want to make sure I break down ideas that have swept into the church or snuck in under the radar that are not true. You know, like I say, there's tons of them that, you know, again, it's kind of like the idea of the Catholic faith. They put Mary up on such a high pedestal that it changes things that are obviously not true. I mean, obviously, yeah, she had other kids.
I mean,
And it was fun.
The level of faith she has is amazing, her and Joseph both, but.
Mary, blessed is she among women. That's a fact. Just like John the Baptist, Jesus said, "Hey man, there's nobody greater that's human than John the Baptist." So I mean, they definitely have their place. But what I'm saying is, what slips into religion or the ideas of religion is they twist things to fit a narrative that aren't. And I'm saying, yes, is Mary blessed among all women? Yes, she is. Do I pray to Mary? No, I don't. I mean, she has her place. She is blessed. But Jesus is telling her in this very first miracle exactly what her place is. This is your place. He loves her. He takes care of her, does exactly what she needs done, but he does give her a little sidebar note that, look, I'm being polite, but you have to understand, I'm on a mission. And these things that you're wanting me to do, well, you don't get to decide my mission. You know. But yeah, but they believe. So, yeah, interesting. Now keep them in your hearts and in your minds. Let me get somebody to pray us out. Who am I going to pick on today? I wonder who I'm going to pick on today. Pick on you, man.
Okay.
You pray us out here.
Our Father, we love the words that Shane is giving us, that you have given him to teach us. Let us go out this week and portray those words to those who do not know you. Father, we love you. We need you. Bless us this week. Be with those that are ill and heal them. Be with us as we go out. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Have you heard that, comedian that talks about?
I just need to go to the next slide.
I watched